Hello, and welcome to the latest installment of Law & Order, the video series where I look at and unpack stories from games. In this one, we'll be diving into Supermassive Games' latest slice of interactive horror. From the world of Dead by Daylight came the casting of Frank Stone. As this was developed by Supermassive Games, as you can imagine, it followed the formula of their previous games, such as Until Dawn and The Quarry. Therefore, it had a heavy emphasis on narrative, with plenty of information to find hidden in areas, along with collectibles to find. As usual, the aim was to try and save everyone, with some particularly gruesome deaths lurking around every corner. Along with that though came a story which posed many questions and was a fairly mind-bending one too in places. So hopefully this video will do a bit to explore what exactly is going on and give some answers to the mystery. We'll also look at how the story connects to the world of Dead by Daylight. If you're enjoying the video at any point, then please feel free to like the video, as it massively helps the video travel through YouTube. Lastly, there will be spoilers in this video for the casting of Frank Stone, so please bear that in mind. But with all that said, let's jump in. It's September 1963. A police officer from Oregon County is searching for a missing child, as the child had recently been kidnapped. Arriving at the Cedar Steel Mill, a fresh 21-year-old officer Sam Green enters the watchman's hut. Inside, he speaks to Tom Holt about his Doberman Pinscher Merlin and how they keep the mill secure from intruders. A number of things can happen in terms of this conversation. Sam notices that Tom is an alcoholic and finds out that Tom is a veteran of the First World War. Checking the records in the mill's logbook, Tom has been faking the entries to cover for the men who work late at the mill and won't sign in or out. He mentions one of the men is called Frank. Sam can be stern with Tom and confront him about his drinking and about how it impairs the memory. Tom can get defensive, but eventually Tom allows Sam to search the mill himself, so off Sam goes. Gaining entry, Sam is searching one of the buildings and is surprised by Tom, who has ventured inside to look for Merlin. They both eventually find him. He is chewing on something and runs off. Inspecting the remains, Sam finds that the remains are human, but that the ear doesn't belong to the child he's looking for. Pushing further in, Sam is able to find a cover for a storm drain, and after prying it open, he needs Tom's help. Now, Sam's attitude and how he spoke to Tom earlier is key. He gives Tom the ear he found and asks him to call the sheriff, Sheriff Cusick, and to make sure the sheriff gets the ear. Tom says he probably needs a drink. What comes next is a small narrative decision that will affect Tom's involvement going forward. Sam can shout at him or persuade him to keep sober, as what he needs him to do is very important. After a rough landing, Sam walks through the storm drain and finds strange markings on the wall. Signs point towards the mill's furnace. Entering the furnace room, Sam speaks of it being like hell and hearing the sound of a baby crying, the missing child he's been looking for. A man stands watching him. He either pushes up the ramp or climbs up the ladder. Either way, it's perilous, as he has to dodge falling debris. Gun raised, Sam approaches the crib but is confronted by the man wearing an intimidating mask. A fight breaks out between the man and Sam. Sam punches the helmet off of him, revealing his face. It's Frank Stone, an ex-convict and a worker at the mill. Frank is freakishly strong and lifts Sam up, impaling him on a sharp pipe. Now, what happens next depends on player action, but for this explanation, I'm going to explain it as follows. Sam gets himself free, limiting damage to his shoulder. He sees that Frank is going to throw the baby in the crib into the molten steel below. Desperate, Sam is able to crawl over to his gun in time and shoots Frank, wounding him and then firing a fatal shot, hitting Frank in the head, causing Frank to fall into the molten steel and get impaled on jagged metal spikes, separating his jaw from his head. Sam then passes out as a result of his injuries. So in the aftermath of what happened, at least in my description, the baby survived and was returned to his parents. Depending on how Sam treated Tom at the mill when entrusting him with doing something for him, Tom would either stay sober or would get drunk. Tom would later be interviewed. If Tom was annoyed by Sam, he'd get drunk and his interview would go like this.
No, I don't. I don't want to talk about it. Well, of course I was there. I'm the watchman. I'm what? Me and my good boy Merlin. Such a good boy. We were just doing our... Frank Stone was there all along now, wasn't he? And we tried to find him, but that baby... Yeah, that little crying little baby. Like I told the sheriff, that's right. The sheriff and me, we're heroes. Huh? Don't you know that? Don't you know anything about that? Get out of here! Get out! Come on!
Tom would then die by falling in the river whilst drunk. If he stayed sober, then Tom's interview would go a little bit differently.
I can remember it clear as a bell. Don't think I've ever experienced anything like that night, before or since. And don't reckon I ever will again. Heck, I don't know if I would have even made it out alive if it weren't for Sam Green. The man's a hero. Damn shame that no-good sheriff's taking all the credit. Damn crying shame. He all but gave up on finding Stone at the mill. Sam Green, he knew better. He came right up and told me we had to search every nook and cranny of that place. And if we had waited just a second longer, well, there'd be one less beautiful baby in the world. Or worse. Sam took Stone down just in the nick of time. Like something out of a movie.
After this, Sam Green and Tom Holt would become good friends, with Tom staying sober and dying of natural causes, and Sam would then give the eulogy at Tom's funeral. Anyway, Sheriff Cusick took credit for the takedown of Frank Stone, but people in the town knew the truth. Cusick, who had no shame, even wrote a book about how he took down Frank Stone. 4 years after the incident in 1967, the mill was to permanently close, as it never reopened after Frank Stone's death. Scrutiny came upon the owners of the mill, the Tester family, as they'd taken on Frank Stone despite knowing about his past and his record as a violent criminal, although at the time he was taken on he wasn't a murderer, but we'll get to that soon. The incident at the mill and the legend of Frank Stone were of interest to serial killer fanatics, sleuths and reporters, with people in the town, especially Sam Green, who had become sheriff after Cusick's retirement, becoming annoyed by it. The mill was later set to be demolished in 1981 and houses were to be built on top of it. We now fast forward to 2024. Madison's mother has recently passed away. Madison is on a plane to the UK and is having a nightmare about her mother's death. Quite a vivid nightmare too. Being jolted awake, Madison lands and hires a car. Driving down the country lanes, she's been invited to a manor called Geraint Manor in Oxfordshire by a woman called Augustine Lieber, who has promised an evening of spiritual enrichment. Maddie spots a hitchhiker. The woman's car has broken down. Maddie can either drive past the stricken woman or stop to give her a ride. Turns out that she's going to the same place that Madison is. Her name is Linda, and she's a filmmaker. Arriving, it seems that no one is home. The front door is open though, and investigating the house, all the lights are off. They enter a room and find another man there, Bruno Stanford III, although he prefers to be called Stan. After some awkward small talk and him being slightly starstruck by the Linda Castle, they discuss what to do whilst waiting for their host. They look around and Maddie finds a copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh, but more strikingly, a poster for a B-horror movie called Murder Mill. Stan points out that Murder Mill was a film by Linda, but she doesn't seem to be too fond of the film itself. She mentions how it should never have seen the light of day and that she wishes it hadn't. Stan says that he heard it was only screened a few times and that the audience flew into a violent rage. He also claims that the CIA used the film in interrogations too. Their host, Augustine Lieber, arrives. She thanks them for coming, says sorry for being late and offers them a drink. If Maddie accepts, then she is confused by the glass. It's the glass she saw in her nightmare. Anyway, Augustine says that she bought them there as they all have in their possession a segment from Murder Mill. Maddie found her segment going through her mum's things. Augustine wishes to make them an offer for it, and she wants the whole film. She says she has matters to attend to in her private reliquary and invites them to make themselves at home. Stan mentions that many collectors have been searching for segments of Murder Mill for years. They discuss why Augustine wants the film so bad. Linda seems to be hiding something though. She knows something is up with the film, that there's some truth to its legend. They need some answers and want to know what Augustine is hiding, so they look around. Stan says that from what he knows about Augustine Lieber is that she's no ordinary collector. She likes collecting items that have a certain darkness attached to them. Looking around, they find a hidden back room which has lots of cameras in it, but there's one that is obscured, the reliquary. Linda wants to know how both Stan and Maddie got their pieces of the film, and Maddie reiterates that she got her piece of the film from her mum's things. And Linda asks for Maddie's mum's name. Maddie confirms that her mum's name was Bonnie Rivera. Linda says she knew her, saying that Maddie looks just like her and that Bonnie's younger brother Jaime, Maddie's uncle, was one of her best friends growing up. Maddie responds that she never met her uncle Jaime. Linda is sad to hear Bonnie passed, and Maddie says that it was sudden. Comforting Maddie, Stan butts in and says that he won't tell him where he got his. That information is apparently very valuable. Looking around some more, they discover a strange door. At some point, Stan, who's been looking out the window, says that he sees someone prowling around the manor grounds. Linda speaks about how it's possible that Augustine expected something like this to happen, or that this person could just be after the film strips. Maddie thinks that they should try and find Augustine, and surmises that her private reliquary is going to be behind the strange door. Stan tests putting his hand through a hole in the gate, and it unlocks a gate to the upper floor. Maddie finds a key for a cabinet, and in said cabinet is a diorama. Grabbing a tree prop from the bottom floor, Maddie places the tree in the diorama and it gives her a toy axe. Placing that on a small statue provides her with a cylinder, and placing that cylinder in the door and using the code found on 3 portraits, the big gate unlocks. Inside they find various items that Augustine has collected, such as items featuring Pazuzu, the Mesopotamian king of wind demons, and she also has some fairly dark and disturbing pieces of art. Speaking with Stan, Linda suggests a wager. If she wins, he'll tell her where he got his piece of the film. She wins a simple coin toss, and he says that he got it off someone named Robbie G, another person that Linda knows from her childhood. This Robbie G is dead now apparently, and Robbie talked about how much his father messed up his life. Augustine also, bizarrely, has Frank Stone's mask. Linda also finds a video camera with a smashed lens, and she seems fairly shocked to see it. Speaking with Maddie, she's found a book which speaks of talismans, that they can protect people. The book seems to have been left open on a specific page, almost as if Augustine wanted someone to see it. At that moment, the elevator comes up and a man walks out of it. He knocks Bruno out, and Linda looks at him, and it's Sheriff Sam Green. Alright, we should probably look at another time period now, so we need to go back to the 1980s to bring some context as to what exactly is going on. 3 friends are shooting their own movie on a Super 8 camera. These friends are Jaime, his girlfriend Christine or Chris, and a much younger Linda. They are filming in the old condemned Cedar Steel Mill. Yet this is the filming of Murder Mill. Chris gets annoyed that Linda didn't manage to get a good enough shot of the blood splattering into Jaime's face, so they shoot another take. However, they are busted by Sheriff Sam Green, whose immediate presence startles Linda as she drops the camera, smashing the lens. And now 38-year-old Sheriff Green tells them that they shouldn't be in there and that they need to leave and never return there again. They can put up some resistance, but ultimately they end up having to vacate as the sheriff's word goes. Back at Jaime's house, they are frustrated that they can't finish their movie and that their camera is busted. Chris had some t-shirts made for the crew, which is basically just Linda, so they have no more budget in order to fix the camera. Talking about Sheriff Green, Linda mentions Frank Stone, and that Sheriff Green was the one who shot and killed Stone at the steel mill, which is why he doesn't want them there. Chris talks about incorporating Frank Stone into the movie. Jaime says that he was a baby when Frank Stone's killings took place. They decide to head into town in order to try and get their camera fixed, but of course, they have no money. Then, Jaime's sister Bonnie walks in. Yep, this is Maddie's mother when she was younger. She lives in New York, but has come back to Cedar Hills in order to help their father get ready for their mother coming home as she's been in hospital. Jaime manages to convince Bonnie to give him $20 so they can go get the camera lens fixed. In town, they spot a new curiosities store, which will probably sell old camera equipment. They can go there first, or they can go to the drugstore and pharmacy to see if they can fix it for them. If going to the drugstore first, Jaime is convinced by Chris to use his acting skills to haggle with the drugstore clerk. Whilst Chris and Linda browse the store, Sheriff Green's son Robert says hello. He's working there for a bit of extra cash, and Jaime breaks some bad news that they can't get the camera fixed there, but tells them that he managed to buy some firecrackers for $5 that they can use in the movie. They inform Robert that they got kicked out of the mill by his dad, and Robert says that there is more than one way into the mill, and that he can show them where it is. Leaving the store, they head into the curiosities store after spotting some cameras in the window. Inside, they are spooked by the old lady who owns the place, and they explain their predicament. So, disappearing into the back room, the old lady emerges with a camera. It's pretty much the exact same. They can accept the price, or haggle, with the old lady giving them a handheld mirror in order to sweeten the deal. With their camera fixed, the group head back to Jaime's house and they see Bonnie taking out her anger by rocking out in the garage. The following day, Jaime is irritated as Chris and Robert are late. They eventually show up and say that they've been to the library, finding old newspaper articles about Frank Stone, have been researching them as a way to incorporate him into the movie. Whilst Chris and Robert look over the articles, Jaime's insecurities come out, and he talks about the fact that because Chris isn't from Cedar Hills, she doesn't understand the sensitivity of the subject in the town, as Frank Stone's victims' families still live there. He also talks to Linda about her plan for some extra scenes to flesh out the backstories of some of the characters. Chris exclaims that she has discovered a picture of Frank Stone working in the machine shop at the mill. With their research done, they leave for the mill. As they're leaving, Bonnie walks in and wonders where they're off to. Arriving at a stream, the group head along the path and have a choice to cross over the creek, which is longer, or to jump the fence, which will take them near to Sheriff Green's patrol route. Whichever one they choose, they arrive at the storm drain, travel through it, and end up in the mill's grounds. But something is going on in the furnace room. Nonetheless, the group finish filming. However, Chris forgot about Linda's extra scene. Choosing to film it, Jaime is scared and surprised by Bonnie, who followed them to the mill. They head into the furnace room and film the scene, with Chris and Jaime's characters being brother and sister. With the scene done, they finish the film. Bonnie and Jaime argue. Linda wants some air, so she invites Bonnie outside, and the two talk about how much Bonnie hates Cedar Hills, and that as soon as her and Jaime's mother is back home, she's leaving town again. Back inside, Robert spots something strange. The other two go over to him, and they've spotted something happening to the foundations of the furnace. Chris films it, and whatever it is, seems to be drawn to the camera. Brushing it off as something that would look good in the movie, they head into the machine shop and into the casting shed. They see a boxcar up high, and after getting the power on and obtaining a key to the padlock, they reach the boxcar. It's smashed through a part of the wall, but what they find there is pretty disturbing. Jaime spots a hand inside a jar and then a head inside another jar. Realizing that this is something that the police missed, Robert says that he's going to get his dad and leaves. Jaime and Chris head back down too, but Chris, somehow completely oblivious to the seriousness of the situation, decides to grab the hand in the jar and film it as part of the movie, to which Jaime objects. Chris and Jaime then argue before either breaking up or making up, and then something happens. A sort of green energy, similar to the energy in the furnace, emanates from the body parts in the lair and from the furnace itself. Then something is up with the camera, leading to the hand in the jar exploding, knocking Jaime and Chris off their feet. What is the spirit of Frank Stone then manifests before them. A door flies open and a portal seems to be behind it, and it tries to suck Chris into it. Jaime has a choice, to confront Frank or to flee. Now here's an important choice from earlier. If Jaime didn't get the firecrackers earlier on and tries to confront Frank, he's immediately killed. But using the firecrackers, he is fruitless anyway, as Chris is sucked into the portal, but at least he tried to save her and he manages to escape with his life. If he simply flees, well, let's just say that Chris isn't pleased but gets sucked into the portal regardless. After their chat, Linda and Bonnie head back into the furnace and encounter an understandably hysterical Jaime, saying that Chris is gone. Linda says that she's going to go and check it out, and she tells Bonnie that Jaime probably needs some air. Heading into the machine shop, Linda finds the camera on the ground. Grabbing it, she heads back outside to find Jaime and Bonnie. Jaime is terrified, saying they should leave. Frank Stone shows up again. Linda looks through the camera and she sees the entity. They run but get separated. Linda ends up in another warehouse and is being stalked by Frank. If she uses the camera, she can defeat Frank for the time being, but if she can't, well, she's placed somewhere rather inconvenient and is later helped by Jaime and Bonnie, and they have to escape it again. But Linda, if she's not caught by Frank, manages to escape him via a scissor lift. But let's now take a trip to 2024. Linda is shocked to see Sheriff Sam Green stood before her. Sam says that he's there because of the movie. He says he's constantly having to clean up because of the movie. He starts rambling on about it being the end of this world and many others. Linda doesn't buy that and doesn't think the film is cursed at all. Sam asks her if she still has her piece of the film, and she says that she does, as do Maddie and Stan, but mentions that Augustine has made them an offer. Sam is pleased to hear that the offer has not yet been finalised and says that they might have a chance to fix things. Maddie is naturally very confused, but Sam explains that the film is a prison. He sounds mental, which Stan duly points out, and you've probably guessed by now that the Robbie G that Stan spoke of was Sheriff Green's son, Robert. Well, according to Stan, Sam has been harassing him for a while. Sam claims that Stan took advantage of Robert's weakened state of mind and took his part of the film. Sam swings for Stan but doesn't hit him, leading to Stan storming off. Linda says that no one should be on their own, so Maddie goes after Stan. She sees him and goes after him, but he disappears. She sees a strange TV in the hallway, and turning it off causes something strange to happen. The environment around her appeared to shift, and she spots a cultist setup and occult symbols on the ground. Bemused, Maddie sees a green glow and enters a large chamber. An otherworldly contraption is there, and she hears a voice inside a sarcophagus screaming for help. Turning the machine off with 3 levers, Maddie sees someone climb out of the sarcophagus. It's Chris, who has travelled there from 1980. Chris thinks Maddie is Bonnie, and Maddie says that she's Bonnie's daughter. Naturally very confused, Chris mentions that she's Jaime's girlfriend, to which a very confused Maddie says Jaime was her uncle. The machine starts up again and they hear a screaming Stan, saying that something is trying to kill him. Now another crucial choice comes up, whereas Chris can choose to stay there or to go back to 1980. For story purposes, we'll just say that she goes back, but don't worry, we'll address the opposite choice as well a bit later. After Chris has been sent back, the machine starts up again, and a black-cloaked individual rises out of the machine. Maddie and Stan run away. Meanwhile, on their way to try and find Augustine, Linda speaks with Sam, and says that he owes her some answers. She mentions that she hasn't seen him this intense since he kicked him out of the mill for making their movie back in 1980. He mentions that he broke their camera, to which Linda says that he never broke the camera, and Sam brushes this off as saying his memory isn't what it used to be, that he's getting old. A bit further on, Sam randomly passes out and murmurs about the sky folding in again and finding someone. Linda can take the opportunity to take his gun from his pouch or to take his journal along with a letter from someone called Logan Chen. Sam eventually comes around again and Linda questions him. She says he's not well. He says that he needs her help. The lights go out and Sam disappears. Linda tries to find him and ends up in an archive room of some sort. She sees t-shirts like the ones Chris had made, but that say "Murder Mine" instead. She also finds a newspaper talking about carnage in a theatre in 1984, but then spots a movie reel on the table. It's an excerpt of Murder Mill, and what she sees shocks her.
Bonnie didn't act in this scene. It was Chris. This isn't right. Okay, that is not what we shot.
Linda looks on the shelves and finds many different versions of Murder Mill, which is strange, as Linda only recalls filming one. Sam surprises Linda. She confronts him, and she says that ever since she saw him walk out of the elevator, she's noticed that he's the same age as her, but he should be at least 80 years old by now. She surmises that this Sam Green is not the Sam Green she knew back in Cedar Hills. Having run away from the hooded individual, Maddie and Stan take a breather. They discuss how they just need to leave. They find a secret passage in one of the bedrooms, and this takes them to a conservatory area. There, they meet up with an arguing Linda and Sam, and Linda tells Maddie that Sam is not who he says he is, that he's an imposter, and that he's not to be trusted. He says that Augustine is not to be trusted, and she's trying to collect every piece of Murder Mill that could ever have potentially existed. Maddie can choose to convince Linda by saying that after what she's just seen, she thinks Sam might be right and that Augustine is lying to them all. At that moment, the projector flicks on and the Murder Mill movie is showing. But which one? Asking for the film strips, they discover that not only did Augustine take the film strips whilst in the parlour, but Stan had already pre-agreed a deal with Augustine for his part, meaning that she's had the film strips this entire time. Linda wonders why she is keeping them there if she's got what she wants. Meanwhile, Chris, having successfully arrived back in 1980, again reunites with Linda, who after escaping, had made her way through the old admin building. Chris tells Linda about what happened, sounding completely insane. She sees Jaime and Bonnie, and depending on whether Jaime chose to ditch her earlier, is either an angry meeting, or a nice one where the two embrace one another. Deciding that they need to leave, Linda says that they could use the storm drain to get out of there, just like how they got in. Unfortunately, Frank Stone shows up and it interrupts that plan. He bashes Chris to the floor, and Linda fights him off with the camera, saving Chris. He then does the same to Bonnie, only he grabs her and impales her on the hook, killing her. Whilst all this has been happening, Robert made it back to town and had been running around looking for his dad. He encountered the old woman from the curiosity store, and she was very cryptic as to where Sheriff Green was. Nonetheless, despite her not helping much, Robert found his dad, and they've arrived at the steel mill. They hear screaming from in the furnace room, and entering, Sheriff Green finds Bonnie there dead. Sam isn't happy with Robert, as he should have known better than to take his friends there. Hearing roaring coming from the storm drain, Sheriff Green jumps down there and tells Robert to stay put. Sam finds the youth's camera on the ground, and following the cries of the teenagers, Sam finds Jaime grievously injured and impaled on a pipe. He helps get him down and defeats Frank with the camera. Telling him to stay there, Sam comes across Chris, who is safe, and then Linda, who is badly injured by the looks of it. And after helping her up, Frank turns up again, and Sam uses the camera to defeat Frank, whilst Jaime and Robert show up too. After a long time, Frank is defeated, and seemingly inside the camera, Sam says that there's still one thing that they need to do. Reeling from watching Bonnie's death on film, an angry Linda exclaims that that's not what they shot. Stan begins to try and get out of there, but Augustine locks them in. The movie shows the moment Frank Stone was pulled into the camera. Stan tries to sneak away, and then Sam can confront Stan, punching him, but he also confronts Augustine, who, by this point, has shown up on the balcony. The sky begins to change, and something begins to happen to the screen. Frank busts through the screen and grabs Stan by the throat. Sam can choose to sacrifice himself, leading to Frank eating him, but for the sake of the story, I'm not going to do that. With Stan dead, devoured by Frank, Frank steps out of the screen, fully manifested in this world. Running, lifting up the bars and getting away, Sam gets separated from Linda and Maddie, who try to get an elevator powered up. Maddie is knocked back by Frank, who bursts out of the door they are standing by. Linda can flee, causing Frank to kill her, and then Frank captures Maddie, or she can confront Frank. He aims a swing, but is stopped, with Stan's soul trapped inside Frank, temporarily distracting him. Linda takes the opportunity to shove Maddie into the elevator and sends it up, with Linda taking the stairs to try and lead Frank away. Maddie steps out of the elevator and into the horologium where Augustine awaits. She tells Maddie that all this serves a greater purpose. She talks about Maddie's nightmares involving the death of Bonnie, her mother, and says that she can make them go away. The pain and the trauma. Maddie can either refuse or accept. If she accepts, then it's basically a trick by Augustine, who plans to sacrifice Maddie. If she refuses, then Maddie has to run to escape Frank. Sam shows up too and distracts Frank in order to save Maddie, but Sam too is able to escape. Augustine has gone outside and looks up at the sky. An entity is piercing through the veil of this world and seeks to devour it. She speaks of lifetimes of toil and torment, all for this one moment. Frank walks up behind her and looks at her as if he recognizes her, and as Augustine speaks of her offerings to the entity, awaiting her reward, Frank kills her. She is then impaled by the entity and claimed. Meanwhile, with her car keys not on hand, Maddie can't drive away and is forced into the woods. There, she sees what happened after the movie was finished in 1980. They all met up in the pharmacy in town, and they split the movie into 3 pieces. Entering a clearing, Maddie finds a campfire, and Linda is sat there. She seems resigned. Sam joins. Other mysterious people are around too. Sam angrily asks why Linda is just sat there. They then hear the roar of Frank Stone, who stands by the campsite, watching and waiting. The survivors now are part of the trials. Frank lets out a roar, and the game then ends. Well, it's very confusing, but we do have a lot to unpack, so let's begin. Let's address the timelines. So there are 3 timelines. Well, we saw 3. There are actually way more than that. The first timeline we see is in 1963, the OG timeline, and where it all began. Where, as Augustine puts it, Sam Green's act of bravado ruined everything. Then we have the 1980 timeline, completely separate from the 1963 and 2024 timelines. There are clues to this, such as the posters in the watchman's hut at the mill. In 63, the poster says, "Lure them in," and in 1980, it says, "Keep them hooked." These timelines or worlds are so close together that there's some bleed through between worlds, as we'll see when looking at various supporting documents found throughout the game. In Jaime's garage, we can find a book about the Omniverse, and this book speaks about the author being able to tap into their own consciousness and visualize another Cedar Hills completely different from the reality they were from, beyond the veil, so to speak. They speak of the owner of the pharmacy, Mr. Calhoun, and his young son George, who was killed by Frank Stone in the 1963 timeline. In the book, the author writes that in this alternate reality, George Calhoun was a middle-aged man who had reached a season of his life that the other George had not been able to. There is a potential complication in terms of these timelines as well though, as if Chris stays and doesn't go back into the sarcophagus, she can end up pushing back through the screen where Frank Stone came from, and she ends up going through the door into the location where the original movie was being shot, ending up with there being 2 Chris's. Maybe this is why Linda was so shocked to see Chris in the conservatory if Chris decided to stay. It's maybe not the first time she's seen something weird happen regarding Chris and her time travelling. Anyway, the author of the Omniverse book speaks of how every journey through life in each reality offers incalculable variations. We see this through Bonnie dying very young in the 1980 timeline, but living a lot longer in the 2024 timeline. And this leads us on to another one of these variations, the fate of the baby. Alright, so some of you probably guessed, but the baby at the start of the game was Jaime. But let's look at some more supporting evidence. In order to really uncover this mystery, you unfortunately have to let Frank Stone kill the baby at the start of the game, and by doing so, he drops the baby's crib into the molten steel before being shot dead by Sam Green. 2024 Linda says that Jaime was her best friend growing up, and Maddie said that she had never met her Uncle Jaime. This tells us that Jaime in that timeline had died at some point in time, or he simply didn't speak to his sister anymore. Whether or not Sam Green saved Jaime influences the dialogue when Sam is talking to Linda, as when she demands answers from him, the conversations go like this.
The only time I ever saw you even close to this intense was when you caught Chris and Jaime and me at the mill.
Yeah. I thought I was being too hard on you at the time. But knowing what I know now, I'm glad I broke your camera.
The only time I ever saw you even close to this intense was when you caught Chris and Jaime and me at the mill.
Jaime?
Yeah, Jaime.
He was one of your buddies.
You're not okay, are you?
Sure I am.
He was my best friend. You can remember me, but you can't remember Jaime Rivera?
Going off of the Omniverse theory from earlier, Jaime in the 1980 timeline actually survived. This is why, even if Frank Stone kills the baby in '63, Tom Holt's interview tape states,
If we had waited just a second longer, well, there'd be one less beautiful baby in the world.
in the archives, if Frank killed the baby at the start, Linda can also find a newspaper which confirms that Frank Stone did kill the baby, meaning that this paper was from one of the timelines in which that actually happened. However, she grew up with Jaime in her timeline, leading to her confused reaction.
Suspect Frank Stone killed during violent showdown in the Cedar Hills mill. But not before. No. Not before Frank Stone tragically took the life of his final victim, identified as Jaime Rivera, only an infant. This must be a misprint.
Sam being confused about who Jaime is simply means that he's from whatever timeline 1963 is. But we'll get to Sam shortly. Next, let's discuss Frank Stone. As we see through the documents in the game, Frank Stone was an ex-convict who was part of a rehabilitation program in order to get convicts back into work. But his background is one we uncover through the story, with some areas only accessible through certain player action. Frank Stone was born Franklin Norman Stone, and by the looks of this letter that Linda finds in the old admin block, Frank was raised by his grandmother, but she was disturbed too. She talked to Frank about how he struggled to make friends, but that it's okay because friends aren't really worth making anyway. She starts to use dark rhetoric in regard to other humans, and this likely influenced Frank's state of mind, and how something is there in his mind, a darkness that lay dormant, waiting for someone to unlock it. At some point in his life, Frank was sent to a psychiatric ward after assaulting someone. In the psychiatric ward, he was seen by a court-ordered psychiatrist, and that psychiatrist was Dr. Augustine Lieber, and she was the one to unlock his potential to become a killer. We hear one of these sessions from March 28, 1961.
Tell me, do you ever feel as though you have a higher calling? This instinct of yours to inflict pain on others, to punish them, I don't believe it is wholly errant. These sessions are all about taking responsibility, Frank. Not just for your past, but for your future, too. Yes, you have a future, and it could be boundless. You simply have to trust me.
So she was the one who suggested Frank should be released early and rehabilitated, and Frank ended up working at the mill. This was on purpose, as Augustine had sensed something there at the mill. She would be granted unlimited and unrestricted access to the mill to follow up with Frank, but she would use this time to groom him into doing her bidding by killing. She'd show and teach him about the Epic of Gilgamesh, and in the process brainwash him into believing that his killings were a righteous act. She mentions the cedar forest and him earning the right to live his destiny forever, and to Frank that destiny became about killing. Frank went on a killing spree whilst working at the mill. The entity got inside Frank's mind, impressed by his killing, and Frank would kill for it, with the violent act being a gateway for the entity to enter our world. Frank had many areas of the mill where he would kill, torture, and maim his victims. In one of these areas, Linda can find Frank's journal. In it, he writes about how he hasn't heard from Augustine for weeks. He's taken 5 names, but says that he feels no closer to the path. He keeps dreaming of the forest and talks of seeing formless shapes beyond the fog, and he'd draw what he'd see on the walls in his lairs. He thinks about some of his victims, Dorothy, George, and Joyce, about how he felt bad for killing Dorothy as she reminded him of his mother, but felt no remorse for killing George or Joyce. He considers purging the entire town of Cedar Hills for their sins, but says he will not act without instruction. A couple of months later, Frank heard from Augustine again, and he had 4 more names, 4 more lives to take. One of those names is noted as DP, and this is Dwight Parker. He was locked up in one of Frank's horrific lairs underneath the mill. He'd left a letter writing about how Frank captured him. Another set of initials, noted as JR, is Jamie Rivera, the baby. And there are 2 others, but it's unclear as to who exactly they were. The BK could have been the Belinda mentioned in this letter, as she'd apparently been murdered. But Sam Green ruined everything that night on Friday the 13th of September. He disrupted the ritual as Frank was to kill the last person. And as you can see, a black cloaked hooded figure was there too, watching, and this was Augustine Lieber. After he died, Frank Stone's essence was seared and burned into the foundations of the mill, awaiting his moment. Augustine was part of the Black Vale, a cult devoted to and who worshipped the entity. They were a secret organization that exists in different realities. In case you hadn't worked it out yet, the old woman in the 1980 timeline was Augustine as well, and she would call this one of her many masks, with one other mask being the psychiatrist of Frank Stone. Many of these masks were just her at different stages in her life. It's unclear exactly how old Augustine actually is, but in the game's secret ending we see that her older self brings a new, younger self from the temporal machine, meaning that although she died in the 2024 timeline to Frank Stone, her older self brought another of her younger selves back through the portal. Augustine would use the temporal machinery and a horologium in order to travel to these different worlds, creating new ones too, in order to find and capture the perfect essence of Frank Stone's spirit in order to set him free for the entity. She just needed to find a way to awaken him, her champion, her key to the entity, and that was through the camera. You see, Augustine wanted to drink in the knowledge of the entity, but the entity wasn't interested in that. It just wanted to devour worlds, to trap people in the fog and make them suffer. Using her method of travel, she would go to the 1980 timeline we see as an old woman. The Curiosity store she owned was formerly owned by an Edwin Olsen, and the shop mysteriously burned down. I think we know who's guilty of that, and as mentioned earlier, Olsen's beloved Belinda was murdered in the store as well. Augustine then had her lawyers contact Olsen with a monetary offer and advice to leave town for a fresh start. Another form of travel from the 1980 timeline back to her mansion were using the TVs. The one in the shop in 1980 would take her to the manor in 2024, and the one in the manor would take her to the shop in 1980. This TV, when switched off by Maddie, appeared to change the environment around her, taking her, and Linda it seems, to another part of the manor, with Maddie finding the horologium and Linda finding the archives. It appears that whenever someone uses this method of transportation, the manor lights either flicker or go off. But Augustine would choose the timeline she travelled to intentionally, where the bleed between these timelines was strong. The night Sam Green shot and killed Frank Stone, his life changed forever. He saw something, that there was something much bigger at work than just some deranged nutcase killing people. Robert says at one point that his dad started taking really long walks in the mill, and Robert thought that was weird. But then...
It's more like an obsession, and it's gotten pretty weird.
Okay, elaborate on that, please.
Maybe it's just the way he was dealing with all the stress or guilt or whatever, but he sort of started researching all kinds of non-traditional philosophies.
Non-traditional?
Like acupuncture with all the pins?
No.
Wait, you don't mean like occult stuff?
Look, I shouldn't have said anything.
Well, you did.
I don't want to give you guys the wrong idea. My dad's a straight shooter. That's it.
Sure.
Whatever you say, man.
We see this through Sam's journal if Linda takes it from him while he's passed out. It's got all sorts of strange symbols in it. Truth is that shortly after, Sam found out about or was likely contacted by an organization called the Imperiati, a rival organization to the Black Vale. This is where the letter from Logan Chen comes in. Logan tells Sam that he's sorry to hear about Robert, indicating that Robert had indeed died, but that it's unclear how exactly. Logan also says that the journey Robert was planning to make, the journey from his timeline all the way to the 2024 timeline, is a dangerous one and comes with risks, such as disorientation, nausea, and loss of consciousness, which we saw whilst he was with Linda. Logan says that whatever information he can take back to them on Augustine and her connection to the Black Vale would be very valuable. He then mentions that maybe Augustine has a similar method of transport to them, meaning the Imperiati also have a machine used to travel. There is an ending which sees Sam escape using the portal, but it's not 100% if he ended up back at his original destination, as Logan says in the letter that sometimes you can get hijacked and end up somewhere beyond the fog. Sam coming from another timeline is hinted at when Stan mentions that Sam is looking better than the last time they met, and that's because Sam was older. And this is something that Linda directly challenges Sam about in the archives. Now we need to look at the differences in the movies to differentiate between them and answer some head-scratching questions in regard to which movie was which. In 2024 Linda's world, they likely shot the film, and that was it. There was no Frank Stone's spirit in her world, no manifestation at all. Heck, Sam Green probably burst into the room, but Linda didn't drop the camera, which is why 2024 Linda was confused as to why Sam told her that he did break the camera, or maybe in another timeline, he physically grabbed the camera and smashed it on the floor. Anyway, it's clear that this Linda isn't the same as this Linda, and that's one of the reasons why she is so confused by what is going on and why she was quite willing to get rid of her film strip, because as far as she's concerned, there's nothing dark about it.
It's one of the first things I ever worked on. Super low budget. We had no idea what we were doing. It should never have seen the light of day. I still wish it hadn't.
Why?
Well, things tend to get blown out of proportion.
I heard it was only screened a few times, and each time the audience flew into a rabid, murderous rage.
No, come on.
Don't try and deny it. The film is legendary.
I think people were just bored out of their minds.
She's also confused when she hears the recording of a news report that mentions violence breaking out at a theatre when the movie had a screening. This likely occurred in another timeline. It sounds more to me like Linda is ashamed of the film. It's a blight on her career, although she does say that it isn't on her official filmography. However, the film did seem to have some sort of strange effect attached to it, as seen from this movie review article. Regardless of the timeline it was in, maybe they were still capturing Frank's essence just by filming in the mill, just not enough to make Frank manifest. Anyway, let me know what you think below. Ever since 1963, when Sam Green ruined the Black Vale or Augustine's ritual in the furnace, she had been doing everything she could in order to find as many pieces of murder mill as possible in order to finish the ritual. This is seen when Linda is in the archives, as she finds many different versions marked Terror and then a number, with Terror referring to each specific world. The film being shown on the projector is a mashup of all the different films that Augustine has collected. She just needed the original film to complete it, I guess. She needed the most pure essence of Frank Stone in order to have him manifest there. Every time the teenagers use the camera to get rid of Frank, is actually them trapping his essence within the camera. As for Augustine splicing the films together, it's possible that this manipulation of reality in the timeline of 2024 actually caused Bonnie to die in real life, but that's just a theory. Hence why Maddie has that particular nightmare and her commenting that Bonnie suddenly passed away. It's also possible that in some other reality somewhere, Bonnie isn't dead. Augustine could have killed her in the 2024 timeline in order to lure a vulnerable Maddie to her manor and to bring the film strip with her. Playing the game, I got this constant thought that there's one loose end. That's Christine. Like, where is she? She's not even mentioned in the 2024 timeline. According to what Maddie sees in the woods, Chris even takes part of the movie when they split it up. So, where is she? And where is her film strip? And then a thought was rattling around my head. I said it as a joke at first, but what if Chris is actually a really young version of Augustine? Then, as the game drew to a conclusion, and as I played through the game a second time, I started to see some things. Chris was from out of town. She wasn't from Cedar Hills. She seemed obsessed with Frank Stone at some point. But then I thought, why does the portal open up for her after she used the camera but not for anyone else? Linda used the camera too, and she didn't get sucked into a portal. After Chris chooses to go back to 1980 using the portal, the much older version of Augustine comes to 2024 straight after. It's certainly possible that Augustine's plan to set the events of the 1980 timeline in motion involved sending a younger version of herself there. But hey, this is just a theory that was rattling around in my head during my playthrough. Christine, Augustine, the similarities in their names there. I don't know how plausible this is, it's just a possibility, but there's not really enough solid evidence in the game to suggest that this is the case. But maybe it'll get confirmed at a later date. So I guess in this section we'll tie everything together and look at both the entity and how the game links into the Dead by Daylight universe. To start, the entity is a cosmic being who is always hungry and seeks to devour entire worlds, for people to kill in its name. It creates the realms of the trial grounds and traps victims there. The survivors by the campfire have been claimed by the entity and are forced to survive against Frank Stone and others in the fog, a realm that exists beyond space and time. In this case, the newest victims are Linda, Maddie, Sam, and I guess Chris, depending on what her true ending was. It needs to be mentioned as well that although Frank Stone is the killer, he's also classed as a victim of the entity too. Although I guess for Frank, he's living out his destiny, if you will. The entity's goal is to consume every single world in the cosmos. The entity can sense the potential to kill in people, exactly the same way the entity saw that potential in Frank Stone. Hence why Augustine identified him and pushed him to commit those atrocities. The way the entity is invited into a world is for someone to commit such gruesome acts of violence that the veil between the real world and the entity's realm is weakened. When a survivor is killed in the trial grounds, the entity then revives them and sends them to the campfire with their memory wiped, ready to do it all over again, dying over and over until the victim is just an empty shell, at which point that survivor is then sent to the subrealm known as the Void. Frank is known as a champion, Augustine Lieber's champion, a killer worthy of the entity. Augustine wanted to drink in the knowledge of the entity and to drink in its glory, but instead she was killed by Frank. She kept the survivors there to trap them there in the fog, her sacrifices to the entity. There are plenty of references to Dead by Daylight in this game. There's the head housekeeper's name, Grimes, which is a reference to Talbot Grimes, who became the Blight. And there's also an interesting book titled Fold of Fear, which references the Druani, also known as the Dredge, which is a monster created out of the dark thoughts of a peaceful community called the Fold. The Dredge would also kill for the entity, and this book is described as a book of fiction in this world, but maybe a dark reality in another. This was effectively a really cool advert for the next villain in the series, Frank Stone, and the survivors being at the campfire is essentially the lobby where players wait to enter the trial grounds. As mentioned earlier, we'll have to wait and see which survivors from this game end up in the trial grounds. But that's it for this video explaining the story of the casting of Frank Stone. I hope you enjoyed it, and this story was very confusing and there are probably a load more questions that are still unanswered. Feel free to leave comments and theories down below. If you're not subscribed, then please do me a favour and subscribe. Like the video if you haven't already, but for now take care and I will see you in the next one.